Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hello and welcome to episode 45 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast with me, Rory Lees-Oakes, and with me is a man who's always in my frame of reference, Mr. Ken Kelly. How are you, Ken?
Oh, exceptionally well. Thank you for asking, Rory. It's great to be here. We've got a really value-packed episode here today, kicking off episode 45 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast, looking at dialogue in therapy, Rory. What do we say in therapy? Can we just repeat over and over again, "Oh, how does that make you feel?"
Oh, yeah. The old cliches. And very grateful for Sarah Bauer, who's brought this up in our Facebook page. And if you don't know about our Facebook page, if you type in Facebook Counselling Tutor, it's two L's in counselling. We spell it the English, British, UK way. And you'll find our community of over 7,000 people interested in the world of counselling and psychotherapy. And we draw the content from our podcasts, sometimes from the people who posted. So thank you to Sarah Barron. She said, basically, I'm worried about asking too often, how does that make you feel? And it's one of those things I often cringe about, Ken, when I see therapists portrayed maybe on the TV or in soaps where someone sits there and looks all kind of ethereal and says, and how does that make you feel? Because, it is a bit of a cliche, isn't it?
It is indeed. So we'll be covering that, and then we'll be moving over to Theory with Rory. Today, Theory with Rory, a really interesting one, because we're going to look at the different periods in person-centered therapy. And up until quite recently, Rory, I'm okay to say that I didn't realise that there were different periods in the development of person-centered theory. When we look to the literature, very often we just look to Carl Rogers, his work, and one specific place in time. But Theory with Rory is going to expand on that today.
Yeah, it is, and the reason I brought it, it's been part of one of my lectures, and I give regular 2 weekly lectures during term time in the CSR as part of the CSR library that we run at Counselling Tutor. And I was doing a lecture not recently on challenge, and a lot of therapists, certainly person-centered therapists, feel a bit uncomfortable about using challenge with clients because it's not person-centered. That's what they say, it's not person-centered. And I made reference to these periods of person-centered therapy where person-centered therapy actually evolved. So I'm going to be exploring how it's evolved. And also I've got a super duper handout listing the periods and a little bit of detail around where the periods were in time, but also about how person-centered therapy subtly shifted and arguably is still developing.
I like that, and I can see the value in that because so often in the assignments we're asked to write about the development of the theory that we're looking at or the model that we're looking at, so that will be really useful. And then we're going to close episode 45 having a bit of a discussion, a debate about what you might look for in a supervisor, what questions you might like to ask a supervisor, how to know if a supervisor is right for you, how to find the right supervisor, how to know what to do if you're in a supervision relationship and you feel that's not working. So we're going to explore that because it's pretty timeless. Many people will be entering their practice, I guess, looking to go into placement. Students in the UK, definitely, and supervision is part of that process. So, kicking off episode 45, looking at dialogue in therapy. And when I say those words, Rory, how does that make you feel?
When you say that, it makes me feel slightly annoyed. and words that I couldn't possibly use on a family podcast. Yes, and I think, to be fair, Ken, it is when trainees start, that's the default position because it comes from the heart sometimes. But sometimes if you repeat it over and over again, it becomes not paraphrasing, but as I used to say, parrot phrasing. And no one wants to see a parrot as a therapist. So considering how we ask that question, because feelings are important, aren't they, Ken?
Indeed, they are. And I guess you're 100% right. And when we opened up, you mentioned that so often if we're looking at a film or reading a book or watching a television program where there is a therapist portrayed, they're often sat there holding a clipboard and a pen for some reason, have no idea what that's there for, and then ask and looking at the client and saying, but how does that make you feel? And it's overused. And I don't know that I've ever used those words within my own practice, although I work with feelings all the time. And I guess we're talking about dialogue in therapy, how we say things to our clients, what that dialogue looks like. So how might we understand where they're coming from and get to grip with those feelings without saying, how does that make you feel? It's very directive as well, isn't it? That how does that make you feel?
Yeah. And one of the ways you can do that, and it's about Socratic questioning. And that question is asking a question where the person who is asking it doesn't know the answer. So, what's a Socratic question I used to say to my students? And they used to look at me and he'd say, that's a Socratic question. And one of the things I might say to a client is there a feeling around that? I may even say, I may even observe in a client who is, maybe I've got a client who is kind of banging the chair with the fist. I might say, well, from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've got a high emotion with that, and I wonder if that's anger. So being curious about
that. I want to dig into that that you've just said there, because that for me is what empathy is, Rory. So when we're there, if we're saying that empathy is understanding the client and where they're at, for us to say, how does that make you feel? I believe distances us from the client. It's saying, I don't know, I can't relate, so you tell me. What you're saying there, Rory, is that by examining that emotion, by saying, I see that as anger, that we're actually connecting with that client, giving them an opportunity to either confirm that, or maybe they may say, no, that's not how it feels, which means we can readjust our frame of reference on that.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. Sometimes, we can pick up on something a client's saying, and by just being curious, they can correct and say, no, it's not, as you say, no, it's not anger, it's frustration. And of course, that leads on to a deeper explanation, because how I might follow that on is saying, okay, so tell me what that frustration is, or what frustration means to you. Because when we deal with words, they have a value. The value of the word to me may be different to the value of the word to the client. So it's about trying to get as close to, as an approximation to their frame of reference and their understanding and their subjective experience as possible. So by being very thoughtful how we question and how we are curious about feelings, and you're absolutely right, it is about empathy. We're going to get closer to where the client is.
I like that. And that's being curious, that's maybe questioning and getting involved in that way. And the other way that we can improve our dialogue, I guess, and our empathic dialogue, that understanding of the feelings, is just by using simple reflection. We can just reflect back the words that the client has used, where the feeling is. So if the client is saying, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then I lost everything, and then blah, 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 you could wait for them to finish that sentence, and then you could go in and say, and then I lost everything. And the feeling is there because you can read it in the body language of the person. And it's an invite for them to explore the feelings and emotions below those words. And very often a client will do that and they'll say, I did. It was devastating. I blah, blah, blah. And they'll pick up from there. And there's you're showing that you understand their feeling. You're showing that you're recognizing their feeling just with a simple reflection, saying the client's words back as they said them. But it's about being intuitive and paying attention to where the words are that do indicate underlying emotions. Absolutely.
And don't be lulled into a false sense of security by believing that the client has a palette of emotions and they can connect the emotions to the words. Because I've worked with clients who, when you ask them how do they feel, they just don't know, because they've not got a vocabulary to be able to articulate their emotions. And it was best summed up by a colleague of mine, Kath Nibbs, who was we were having a bit of a chat, and she was saying about working with young people, and she said a child walked into a piece of furniture and banged her arm and looked at her And the girl said, ouch. And the child went, ouch. And sometimes when we're reflecting back feelings, it may be that the client doesn't realise what those are, because as children we're taught emotions, we're taught the vocabulary of it. So unless we're taught the vocabulary of it or inherit a vocabulary from our experience, then sometimes clients just don't have the feelings. Sometimes we have to work with it kind of intuitively with the client to help them gain a sense of what that feeling is, and that can be very, very precise and very intricate work in the therapeutic relationship.
I love what you've said there. And by us using that overused, inappropriate question of how does that make you feel, the client may not know. They may not be able to name that feeling that's going on inside them. And I guess we are feelings illiterate in the Western world in general, in that we have very basic words. I'm happy, I'm sad, I'm angry. But it doesn't really go much deeper than that. And I guess as therapists, we're called on to understand feelings at a deeper level. And this is where I believe journaling is so important, because if you're journaling your own life, and what I usually suggested, certainly to my learners, was that rather than journal what happened today, look back on today and journal the feelings that you felt. And very often you'll find yourself going, well, it was, I don't really know. And you can maybe then describe what you were feeling. Was it a tightness? Was it a knot in the stomach? Was it a churning? What was going on for you? Was it thoughts that just kept on tumbling around in your head? And try and find words that label that feeling for you. And that's going to only be for you. And those labels may not fit for your clients. But if you're able to go through that decoding process for your own thoughts and feelings and your own emotions, then maybe you can be there and help a client find their own words to name their feelings. I think you've hit a very big nail on a very big head there, Rory.
Well, thank you very much. And I will put my huge hammer away. But yeah, and it comes, to answer your question directly, it comes with practice. There's no shortcuts to this, and it's a craft that you practice through a lifetime of the arc of being a therapist. And sometimes, I speak for myself, I get it right, and sometimes I have to kind of work a bit harder to try and get into the client's frame of reference. But yeah, avoid how does that make you feel, because it is a bit overused. And if someone said it to me, I think I might be a bit short, possibly.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. So maybe continue this conversation. You might be listening to this and thinking, hey, I've got some ideas on this. We'd love to hear your ideas. And you can join this conversation by coming to the Facebook group. That is, just bob onto Facebook, type in Counselling Tutor, knock on the door, come and join. Like Rory says, over 7,000 like-minded students of counselling and psychotherapy from all around the world, and come and, I guess, have this conversation.
Yeah, we'd love to see you. And also, why not visit our home page, our mother page, at www.counsellingtutor.com. 2 L's again in counselling. And that's just absolutely cram-packed full of all information around counselling, psychotherapy, used by students throughout the world. And if you go to the top right-hand corner, click on Facebook, you get into our Facebook group. And sometimes me and Ken come in, have a chat and share our ideas. But what a fantastic group. It's just brilliant, isn't it?
Indeed it is. So moving on to theory with Rory, person-centered therapy, that's something that's very dear to my heart. But there's different periods of development of person-centered therapy, Rory, and you're going to kind of be giving us an overview of that, linked into a lecture that you gave in the Counselling Study Resource on Challenge, where this came up. And I remember when the actual lecture came up and you were mentioning those different periods, it was kind of new for a lot of us that were there.
Absolutely. And I can remember being in a supervisory group when I taught and talking about challenge, and one learner becoming very uncomfortable, and I said, it looks like this isn't fitting for you. And she said, well, it's not person-centered. And I said, okay, let's talk about that. And she said, we don't challenge in person-centered therapy. I said, okay. So person-centered therapy, it has had a wide journey from its roots in the 50s to today, and it's still an evolving therapy. So what I'm going to be talking about, and as I made reference to in my lecture, I'm going to be talking about 3 specific periods that have been evidenced and talked about in literature. And one development which kind of moves us into what we call ethical eclecticism, which is kind of interesting, where we're using person-centered therapy, but we might develop other skills in the service of the client. But what we're doing is we're not just bolting on, I'll just bolt some CBT in or bolt some TA on. What we're doing is we're saying, I'm going to bring this into my practice, but I'm going to bring it in a person-centered way.
Counselling Theory with Rory Lees-Oakes.
A few years ago, I was giving a lecture on challenge to a group of students who were practitioners. They were out and about in their practices, supporting and helping clients. And as I started to kind of warm up the lecture, one of the students put their hand up and said, I don't really believe that we should challenge clients. I don't think person-centered therapy is about challenge. And I inquired, I was curious, and I said, I wonder where that idea has come from, where that notion finds its root. And the student said that their supervisor was a person-centered supervisor who'd said that there's no room for challenge in person-centered therapy, which I thought was quite interesting. And I know that if I talk to a wide range of person-centered therapists, they all have a slightly different take on what person-centered therapy is. Some may very well do expressive therapies. They may do work with clays or paintings or figures. Some may use writing or drawing to help a client. And one of the things that we can all agree on is the basics, which is the 6 necessary and sufficient conditions. All of us agree on the 7 stages of process, although some would disagree if it's as linear as Rogers made out. And all of us have a great respect for phenomenology and the 19 propositions, which can be a bit unfathomable, but effectively are Rogers' theory of personality in 19 statements that describe and explain how individuals engage with the world as they perceive it and feel it. But no two person-centered therapists are the same, and the reason for that is that Rogers didn't set a template out to what a person-centered therapist should be. He basically said you just need to be yourself, and of course many of us, all of us, are different. We're all different individuals. But the question I asked her, my student, was, is person-centered therapy just set in one part of time? Did she know that person-centered therapy went through distinct phases and developmental phases and still has through the years? And she said no. And those are the phases that I'm going to share with you today, because person-centered therapy wasn't developed in a year or 2 years or 3 years. It was developed in 30 or 40 years, and arguably it's still being developed and still being discussed. So I'm going to talk about the 3 distinct phases, or periods as they're known. So the first period is 1940 to 1950, and this is where Rogers really kicked the idea off. And this phase is sometimes called non-directive psychotherapy. So this was a real shift from the work of the Freudians, the psychoanalysts, the behaviourists, who were effectively prescribing what clients should do or telling them how they are, to the therapist saying, okay, to the client, tell me about you. What's your experience? I'm working with that. And the idea of this very early period in person-centered therapy was to create a non-judgmental, non-interpretive atmosphere. So in other words, the therapist wasn't analysing, but was listening to the client, listening to their experience. And the two key things here is acceptance. So we're looking at unconditional positive regard and clarification. So the use of questions to clarify, to make sure that the therapist's perception of what the client's saying was accurate and they were both effectively on the same page. And the goal of the therapy at that time, or the changes of personality as it's sometimes known, was to help clients gain a sense of a personal insight of themselves and of the situation. And that was it. And that went on for 10 years. And then another period started to emerge, which was from 1950 to 1957. Now, that's quite a small period of time. And in this case, it was a reflection on feelings and also avoiding any kind of threat in the relationship. Now, when I'm talking about threat, I'm talking about really the idea of the therapist being congruent and real. So moving one step away again from that old Freudian or behaviorist idea where the therapist was the expert, to them being seen more by the client as just another person helping them on their journey, helping them to try to understand. And this period is sometimes called reflective psychotherapy. And the reason it's reflective is because it's reflecting feelings. So clients would have their feelings reflected back to them. It feels like you're angry. It feels like you're sad. It feels to me like you're frustrated. And the idea of this was to develop their self-concept. So the behavioural change that this phase of the therapy really focused on was getting the clients to understand their own subjective experience in what's termed the phenomenal field. And the phenomenal field is basically our moment-by-moment experiencing of the world as it is around us. And then there was a third period or a third phase, and that's called experiential therapy. And the focus really was on the client's experiencing and also expression of the therapist's experiencing. So here for the first time, the therapist is moving to even more congruent position by reflecting to the client how they're experiencing them. Now, this was something really quite new, and also, if you think about it, quite helpful, because what you're getting is a very supportive form of feedback. And this was about interpersonal communication and the idea that we can communicate internally to ourselves, but also other people can communicate to us that touches our internal frame of reference. And it was direct experiencing. And this phase kind of moved on to focusing, emotional focusing, which was developed by one of Roger's students, Gendlin. So it's interesting, isn't it, that person-centered therapy isn't just fixed in 1 year or 2 years. It's movable. It's a movement across almost 30 years, and it's still being developed today. And in fact, one of Roger's comments on discussing his daughter, Natalie Rogers, who became a psychotherapist and developed her own theory called expressive arts therapy. Rogers said she was ploughing a new field. She was developing person-centered therapy in a different way. So it's really fascinating. Rogers left us a legacy not only of the theory that everyone learns in college, but also about how it's developing. And it's a discussion that's still being talked about today. When I see person-centered therapists, we're always kind of interested in how our views of person-centered therapy are. And I guess that's Roger's legacy. So what I'd like to do is, if you indulge me, when you hear this podcast, have a reflection on your person-centered practice if you're a person-centered therapist. And why not pop some comments in the comments bar below? Let's get a discussion going on what you think person-centered therapy is or how you practice it. And it may be that we can give people a wider view into what person-centered therapy is, which, of course, was Roger's great ambition and I guess his great dream. I'm going to do a handout and I'm going to put the 3 phases in. You can download that, and also a little bit about what these phases represent and what the personality change is.
Thank you very much, Rory. Really interesting stuff there. And of course, if you want to get Rory's super duper handout that was mentioned, it's really easy. You just go to our mother website, that is counsellingtutor.com. Click on the podcast tab, that's right there in the top menu bar, and go on down to episode number 45. There you will find the show notes for today's episode, and you can download Rory's handout from directly within that page. It'll be sent directly to your inbox. So moving on, and we're going to be looking at supervision, Rory, but more around if you are new, you're just going to placement, you're looking for a supervisor, what might you look for in a supervisor? What questions might you ask for a supervisor? If you're new going to supervision, what preparation might you do?
Yeah, and we're grateful to Issy McCann, who's again one of our Facebook posters, and she says, "Evening all, I'm in the process of arranging to meet a prospective supervisor who has suggested I go prepared with a list of questions. Any suggestions? Very much appreciated." So yes, I think it's really useful to go with a list of questions, and I think the first question I would ask is, what modality do you supervise in? Do you understand my modality of therapy? Because through the arc of a therapist's career, they may do CPD courses, they may even train in a different model than the one they originally trained in. But it's really, really super important that if someone's supervising you and you're doing a CBT course or a person-centered course or a TA course, is that your supervisor has a working knowledge of that model. Because if they don't, they're not helping you in that quadrant of your learning where you're applying what you're learning in college, the theory, to the practice. So that's the key area there. How much do you know? And you could ask them, what's the introjected value? What's the condition of words? What's phenomenology? Yeah, quiz them. I mean, the thing is, you are paying them.
100%.
They are no different, I have to say, than if you're employing a plumber or an electrician or a painter and decorator or someone to change the tire in your car. You're exchanging money for a service, and you should be getting the best possible service. So ask away.
I think that the main takeaway from your point there, Rory, is that when you enter into a supervisory relationship, it can be a long-term relationship, specifically if you're entering as a learner. So it's part of your studies that you're going to have this supervision to underpin your placement. Your supervisor is going to be providing reports that are going to be submitted for your final portfolio, going towards your qualification, and it's important to find a supervisor, but it's probably more important to find the right supervisor, because changing supervisor during your study period can be really tricky, because with ABC awarding body, you need a 50-hour supervision report and a 100-hour supervision report. And if you change supervisors, they need to have supervised you for that 50 hours or that 100 hours to be able to give that report. So it is really important that you find someone that you are happy to stick with for the duration of your training. And of course, as you quite rightly said, Rory, you're paying for this service. They're not your boss, they are your supervisor. You're going in there and you're choosing this in the same way as a client might come and choose who they feel comfortable to do their counselling with. So yes, check their modality. And I would go a little bit further. I would ask them what framework they work to make sure maybe that your awarding body and the framework that you will be joining, maybe the BACP, that they are maybe a member of the same framework. It's not necessary that they are, but it's worth asking. And also, if you're working with a very specific client group, so your placement is, say, in bereavement, then I might ask that supervisor whether they have any understanding or any done any continued professional development in that area, so that they are better able to understand the client group that I might be bringing.
Yeah, I agree 100%, Ken. And the other thing is, I would ask them, how will you support me if I'm feeling less than, or I'm feeling a bit incompetent? There's something that I'm going to cover in a podcast and even a lecture called FOI, Feelings of Incompetence. Ooh. And it's documented. It's a well-known phenomena within counselling, and certainly for student counsellors, where that phase of conscious incompetence, where you're learning through those little mistakes or little learning opportunities, as I call them. I would ask my supervisor, how will you support me with that? Because what you don't want is someone who is kind of overbearing and maybe you feel you can't bring yourself. And I tell you what, it's really interesting. I was giving a lecture a good few months back, and I got talking to one of the delegates, and we got talking about a specific presentation, just on a one-to-one in a little training group. And she said, I didn't take that to my supervisor because I was frightened. And my tutor kind of head came on, and I said, just tell me in a safe place for you, why was it you couldn't take it to your supervisor? And she said, I felt I was judged. And I'd say, I would take that to your supervisor. That might 100%. Be your frame of reference. But what I would say is, I would take that to your supervisor and say, sometimes I feel judged. And if a supervisor said that to me, a supervisee said that to me, I would say, okay, tell me a little bit about that. Can you think of any time? And maybe I would have to think back and think, well, maybe what I said, it was misinterpreted, or maybe, if I'm honest, maybe I was a bit sharp. It does happen with human. But it's about building the relationship. And if you feel you can't discuss something with your supervisor, I think that that's a big problem for the client, because supervision is about expanding and breathing and living the values of being a therapist. So, yeah. And one other thing, Ken, and to those who are listening, if you go and see a supervisor and you come away and you think, I've got a really bad feeling about that, don't discount that supervisor. Live with that feeling. Try and make sense of it. Because sometimes we meet people, and our old friend, I'm going to mention our old friend transference again.
Yes.
Sometimes our old friend transference can come in. And when I've had students, they said, I really don't like that person. I'd say, okay, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to live with that feeling and work out what it is before you make a decision, because there's something going on for you. And 9 times out of 10, they would come back and they go, do you know, they reminded me of and then they would say, it reminded me, or something in the house reminded me. And they go on to work with that supervisor and have just a fantastic supervisionary relationship. So those are the kind of questions I'd ask.
That is interesting. And my takeaway from that is that this is a relationship. And it's a relationship that will develop, and it can be a very close relationship. You want to be in supervision with somebody that you feel safe with, a threat-free environment where you can bring the stuff you really don't want to bring to supervision. If you are in practice, you're in placement, and there is something you're ashamed to take to supervision, that's the stuff you want to be taking into supervision. That's the important stuff. That's what supervision is for. And you want a supervisor where you can take that, and that will be accepted with unconditional positive regard towards yourself, without judgment, in the same way as we accept our clients that come to us, no matter what it is that they bring. So you want to have choose a supervisor that you feel comfortable with. And I would recommend that you see a number of supervisors. I would say 3 or 4 supervisors before making a decision, because it's a commitment. It's a at least for the time of your studies, a long-term commitment. And I would also suggest that if you are in a placement where the placement are kind of saying you have to use our supervisor, I would see how that feels for you. Does that supervisor match what you feel your needs would be? And if they don't, you need to ask yourself some difficult questions. Am I okay to practice and take and work with the supervisor? Do I need to maybe pay externally for another supervisor? How that might interact and relate to your practice? There's some difficult questions there, but it can be frustrating if you find yourself 30, 50 hours into your placement with a supervisor that you do not feel supports you.
Yeah, and yes, that's a whole new podcast, Ken. But just to say that it's not unusual now for placements to come with built-in supervision. And while there's not an ethical issue around that, I want to be clear about that, they're doing nothing wrong. I think that you really, really do have to consider if the supervisor they provide is going to help you. And if that's not the case for whatever reason, then, you might need to think, well, maybe this placement isn't for me. And Robin Shohat, who is really the grandfather of supervision in terms of supervisory theory, the seven-eyed model. And I know that you've just recently qualified as a supervisor, Ken. He says it's a place where the profession breathes.
Oh, definitely. It's an interesting subject. It's a subject that comes up again and again in our Facebook group and across our different platforms in Counselling Tutor. And it's one that we will address again and again, Rory. And as you said, you can take any of the micro points in this and you can make a whole podcast just about that. We have great depth in that we practice as counsellors and psychotherapists. So we'd love to hear from you. What do you think about supervision, your supervision relationship? And of course, we don't want to get into case details, but of course, we can speak generically on the Facebook group, and that is counsellingtutor.com is our website, and the Facebook group, just put in Counselling Tutor. Come knock on the door, come and join us, and let's get the conversations flowing. Great episode, Rory.
Yeah, absolutely. We started off by talking about dialogue. We talking about how we work with clients, how we communicate with them. We're looking at the theory, a person-centered theory, how it's moved through an arc, and how we may be practicing in a newer way of person-centered therapy. And finally, important questions in supervision. It's just a jam-packed episode. So that wraps it up from us. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.